We're going into a new environment, guys. Not just going into the water, we're going underwater. Competition today is virtually a bloodbath. Because not only are people doing everything wrong, but the training is wrong. If you're not training your reflexes, you're not training for freediving. Okay, the whole story began with me after we got kicked out of the Sinai. One time Israel occupied the whole of the Sinai. And then in 1979, we got kicked out of the Sinai. I'd been down there with a German group feeding sharks from the hand. I think we were the first people to feed them without cages. It was quite an adventure. It was a wonderful time, and it was a lot of fun, a lot of laughs, and it was good. But then I was like a lost soul, because I felt like Adam. I felt I'd been kicked out of paradise, because I loved the Sinai very much. I loved the desert. I loved the Bedouin there. I loved everything about the place. And suddenly everything was gone. So everything changed. I wandered around the Pacific for some time, and Pacific Islands, Ponape, Truk, Yap, Anatahan, Pagan, blah, 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 blah. Ended up back in San Francisco, and that is really where the story begins. After San Francisco, we went down to San Diego, and there I had been given contacts with somebody that I should get in contact with in order to get in contact with all the rest of the freedivers in Southern California. Anyway, he gave me, amongst those contacts, contact with a guy called Bert Kobayashi. He was a Japanese American, a professor in Scripps. He taught recreational diving. Everybody who was studying in the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, if they were studying oceanography, if they were studying marine biology, whatever it was, they had to do diving with as well. And he was a superb instructor. That was the cold Pacific, and it was really beautiful with all its kelp forests, and I loved it. We struck up a great friendship. He was a fantastic cook, and Japanese style, and I love Japanese food, and we hit it off. Anyway, he gave me a lot of introductions and scripts. One of them suggested that I go down to the Baja. I'd never heard of it before. And he said it's like the Sinai, which in a way it was. It was desert by the sea, but a different kind of desert and a different kind of sea. And it was one of the most beautiful places on the face of the earth. Cousteau called it the giant fish trap of the world. It had every different kind of ray, the small rays, the little mobulars, up into the giant Pacific rays. And it had every type of shark you would imagine, including the great white, the open water sharks, the reef sharks, everything. And. I mean, it was just a sea of life. You saw schools of dolphins a kilometer across, mobular rays, a kilometer, 2 kilometers across. I mean, it was something that you couldn't even imagine. And it was intensely beautiful. We found ourselves off a seamount and watched sharks catching tuna there, bonito, actually. And it was mako sharks, and they're the fastest thing you could ever imagine. You saw them here, you saw them over there, and you saw damn all in between, yeah? I mean, they were so fast, it was incredible. You go, whoop, whoop. And it was quite a circus. We saw something like 200 of them catching bonito at short range. Anyway, it was a wonderful education. But then I began to discover the whales there. Now, the fascination of my life has always been those whales, the deep diving whales. Peary's beaked whale, Cuvier's beaked whale, the beaked whales that we found on the beach together in the Isla San Jose when 12 of them beached themselves there. Why do whales beach themselves? Because some Navy geniuses do sonic warfare underneath, and that frightens them when they're at depth. They dash to the surface, get decompression sickness, and in agony beach themselves to commit suicide on the beaches. And 12 of them, males, had done that, and we went, and if you remember, we extracted a tooth from one of the whales there. I think you probably still have the tooth. Nod if you do. Okay. Anyway, this began my fascination, and I it also began shortly after this. That period in Baja finished for me. I went back to Israel and I started working in a dive center in aquasport. One day, two of the biggest guys in freediving, Umberto Pellizzari and Pipin Ferreras, walked into the dive center, and I sat there with my mouth open, in my usual intelligent expression. I was amazed. I'd seen their pictures, obviously, in journals. There was a French journal called L'Apnée, which I was a regular reader of, and nobody else recognized them. I went up to them, sat down, and we became friends. They invited me to dive with them. I did, and it began an association where, after they went down to the Sinai to dive together to make an Italian movie, we had a dinner together in a restaurant in Eilat called The Last Refuge, which has got a terrific story behind it, but never mind. And after it, Pipin invited me to Cuba to train. I didn't really believe anything was going to happen. 3 weeks later, I get a letter in the post, and it's from Paris. And I thought, shit, I don't know anybody in Paris. So I opened this very carefully in case it blew up and blew my hands off or something interesting. And it was a ticket to go from Israel to the Cuban embassy in in Paris, pick up my visa there, and an onward ticket to Cuba, where I would be a guest of the Cuban government and Pipin Ferreras for something like a month and a half. Okay, I did. That changed my life. I came back from there, and that was the last course that I ever did in teaching scuba. After that, I taught only freediving. We were doing sled diving, yeah, and Pipin eventually came to Eilat in another visit a little bit later on and taught sled diving to 7 of my best students. Now, I became fascinated by this subject. In those days, it wasn't so much competition, it was finding out where the human limits were. Nobody knew. How far could we go down? What was stopping us? Well, one of the things was definitely equalization. Well, Pipin solved an awful lot of that, and this, for instance, would make him a pioneer with a legacy. Yeah? And I look back on all the champions, and I ask myself, what is your legacy? What have you left behind? Numbers, some have left behind a feeling of terrific sportsmanship, but what else? Pipin left behind a way of equalizing, which was flooding, and the two kinds. One is passive flooding, which is when you go down in the sled head up and knees first. That is passive, and then there's an active flooding where you go down head down, which is the way we normally go when we're diving in any type of competition diving or recreational diving. That's much harder to do because we have to invite the water in. So I became fascinated with this. I became fascinated with what are our limitations. So I looked for information everywhere. And then I discovered scientific papers. The first was Dr. Per Schollender's Master Switch of Life. He was a discoverer of the mammalian dive reflex. He explained the cold water drowning reflex, and he began to explain nearly all the reflexes. Then I discovered after him Carl Schaefer, who was the physiologist who accompanied Bob Croft on his adventures to beat everything. And then while I was in Cuba, suddenly things came to light. Jacques Mayol's book, Homo Delphinus, came out in French. Well, I spoke French. Pipin spoke French because he'd had a French wife. Okay, so we shared the book, and in it was a story of a Greek guy called Hagistati. This you will find on the internet. It's a story of a Greek sponge diver who went and rescued the anchor of the Regina Margherita, a big Italian battleship, in a Greek island called Karpathos back in 1911. Okay, how does this all connect? This guy when they lost the anchor, the captain was completely lost. He said, what do I do? Don't forget, the ships in those days weren't atomic, they weren't diesel, they were based on coal. Now, he had enough coal just to get back to Italy, but there was a very bad storm on the way, so they couldn't leave port, and he had no anchor now, so he had to go round and round in circles, burning coal, and then they wouldn't have enough to get back to Italy. What do I do? So he sent the doctor, who was the most intelligent person aboard, to go and see the Proderos, the mayor of the island. And the doctor said, explained the situation, said, can you help us out? And the mayor said, never mind, I'll fix you up. If a Greek says this to you, run. Yeah, but anyway, he didn't, and he went back, and the next day they were expecting to see a hard hat diver with a little wagon with the suit and the hard hat and the heavy boots and the compressor, the handheld compressor and all the rest of it. And don't forget, they were invented in 1843, the Seed Gorman. This is 1911, so they were well known and well practiced, and this could have been a possibility, but there wasn't one on the island. Instead, what turned up was a guy, an unprepossessing looking specimen, about 40 years old, with a rope round his chest and a big lump of marble attached to the rope. And they laughed at him and said, what the hell are you going to do? You can go down how much, 6, 7 meters? He said, never mind, I'll fix you up. Now, the anchor had gone down on a slope at the entrance to the bay, and they didn't know how far down the slope it was. It was marked on the surface, yeah, but this wouldn't give you an exact marking. If you've got a surface thing and it's onto a slope, you still don't know how far you've got to go down. They started diving at 105 meters, Hagi and his brother. Wow. Okay, we can put the clock forward till the 1950s when, anyway, the top scientists in the world said our lungs would collapse if we went deeper than 50 meters. Yeah, we were past residual volume and our lungs would implode. Anyway, they went to Enzo, who was then trying, as and all the people who've seen The Big Blue realized, to beat Jacques Mayol. They went to Enzo, who was trying to get to 50 meters, and they said, Enzo, we have just made an incredible model of the human thorax, and we've taken it down to simulated depth of 100 meters at 11 atmospheres. Sorry, I beg your pardon, cancel that, to 60 meters, 50 meters, 6 atmospheres, and the thing imploded. So we can tell you that certain death is waiting for you. Enzo didn't know physiology too well, but he did know Italian. So he said to me, you know what, vaffanculo. Yeah, well, I won't translate that, but anybody can tell you it's not very polite, but F off. So, and Enzo went down eventually to 105 meters some years later. Okay. This was apparently the end of freediving, but it wasn't, because Enzo and other people ignored the warnings of the scientists. Eventually the scientists began to get interested. They began to ask, you know, what's going on here? Why didn't his lungs collapse? Well, Carl Schaefer, who was dealing with the American, who was leading the pack at that moment, came up with the answer. He said to Bob Croft, he said, Bob, I think I know why Enzo's lungs do not collapse. He said, I believe it's because the blood leaves the arms and the legs, goes to the core and protects the lungs. And I'm going to prove this with you. So anyway, he said, look, I'm going to put you in the recompression chamber, and we'll do a test there with bands on your arms and legs, and we're going to measure resistance of a passage of electricity, small amount of electricity through your limbs as you're in a tank of water and at 6 atmospheres. So they did so. Carl was the first person to actually demonstrate blood shift. I began to be interested in all this information, and then I started to ask myself all the questions we can ask, and it's involved me in something that we've got into today. One of the main questions was, and here I come to it, how can a whale that is smaller than the orca, or about the same size, the Pires beaked whale, not a big whale, dive for 3 hours and 40 minutes on a single breath to depths measured in kilometers? Wow. How is that possible? So we had to look for what was happening here. And one of the things which stood out a long way was deep diving whales have a different proportion of myoglobin and hemoglobin to what we have. We have, let's say, 90% hemoglobin and 10% myoglobin. I don't know what the exact figures are in front of me right now, but you can check this out, and they have more or less the reverse. Now, the myoglobin allows them to store oxygen in the muscles, and it's withdrawn to the brain as necessary and as dictated by hypoxia. Okay, there's another story. They go down empty lung. Funnily enough, they don't want to get decompression sickness, which they can get, and they won't if they go down empty lungs, and they don't want to get, we don't know, narcosis. So they avoid some of the biggest dangers by their strategy of diving. So I sat there and I thought, well, what would happen if we could alter, even by a small amount, the amount of hemoglobin, myoglobin? And that's where a very lady who's cooperating with us, and it comes to our project right now, comes into the picture, Erika Chagatai, who I'd already had a relationship with for some years, of corresponding about various things, and we had met before, but briefly. And I met her in a conference in Eilat, and she said, what are you thinking about, Aharon? And I said, hemoglobin, myoglobin. She said, wow, that's interesting. I'll let you know if I come across anything. So 6 months later, I get a message from her. I found it. So I thought, wow, what have you found? Come on, give it out. And she said, look, I'm at the Everest base camp where people get acclimatized to hypoxia. From 21% oxygen at sea level up to 7% oxygen on the top of Everest. So I did blood tests on them, and I found that during the time of acclimatization, the ratio of hemoglobin, myoglobin changed. So I'd always been told by the physiologist, oh, no, this can't happen, Aharon, it's written in your DNA. Well, this made that into bullshit. Yeah, there we are, it could be changed. Now, how do we change it? We're not going to go running up Everest every day. But what we can do is get used to hypoxia. Now, you cannot do a whole bunch of dives to 90 meters every day. And you certainly can't do it, more than a couple of times a week. So how do we do this? Dive empty lung. Just a few, one word of introduction to this passage, because here we're talking mainly about your training. We're talking about how to do RV training properly, because an awful lot of it is being misunderstood, misused, and then people are not getting the result that they want to get and should be able to get. So we've got to clear up that mess and move on. And I just want to add into this, I've been asked the question, why did I suddenly decide that RV training was the thing and went hot, mad, crazy about it? Well, let me deal with that one first. If you've been following, and I've been not only following, but training people for competition. Competition today is virtually a bloodbath. Because not only are people doing everything wrong, but the training is wrong. Sorry, guys. Look, people are, in one way, half-trained because they're not training for freediving. The only true freedive training is when you're training to your reflexes. This is what makes freediving different from every other sport. Basically, this is not only for reasons of how you set up everything, it's not the reasons of your VO2 max or anything like this. If you're not training your reflexes, you're not training for freediving. It's as simple as that. And the reason for this is one word: adaptation. We're going into a new environment, guys. Not just going into the water, we're going underwater, unlike swimmers. They go in sometimes for brief periods. We go in for long periods and we go deep. Okay, that needs physiological adaptation. If you're attempting to do that on full lungs, that's going to take years. Because how many dives can you do in a week to 90 meters? You're going to dive every day to 90 meters? You need, in order to get adapted to those pressures and those depths, you need a hell of a lot of training. The system has to adapt. And it doesn't adapt from one tiny little clue. So there's only one way we can do that, and that is by empty lung training. Because there we're simulating exactly the pressures and everything else that happen at great depths. The main and the basic difference is time. A dive to 90 meters should take about 3 minutes on full lungs. A simulated dive to 90 meters, depending on what RV you've got, take about 20 seconds or maximum somewhere between 20 and 40 seconds. Therein lies the difference. But everything else, all the physiological reactions, the blood shift and everything are happening in that time period. Now, you can do simulated dives. How many can you do in a day to 90 meters? 8, 9? In one session. How many sessions can you do a week? 3, 4? And maybe you can do 3 or 4 dives on full lungs. Do you get the point? It's saving you months of training. So this is what occurred. Adaptation first. The other thing is it's an ideal ring, or whatever you like to call it, for experimenting. It's a time for experimenting. You have the conditions for experimenting. And also for testing equalization at depth. And other things. We'll come to all that in the thing. So this is what occurred, basically. What's happening in competitive diving? A lot of the records are being done with a sea of blood. People have got into using dope and hiding it. Quite a lot of the dive is psycho stuff because it requires quite a lot of bravery, to go into something where you know nearly for a certain fact that you're going to be hurting yourself. That's not a way to dive, guys. There's insufficient knowledge about the real physiology of the reflexes and everything else, and damn all effort to train towards them. If you don't train your reflexes and everything, you are, as the Americans would say, cruising for a bruising. So that was the basic thing that got me into it, the final straw. Interest in that direction, everything as inspiration, I mean, inspirational stories. The story of Hagistati, where they were diving to 105 meters at first and eventually found the anchor in 77, is a story that changes the whole picture and the concept of physiology, adaptation, everything. How did they equalize? What were they doing? I mean, they were clomping around on the bottom, stark naked, because there weren't wetsuits in those days, yeah? And they didn't even have nose clips, and they certainly weren't doing it in masks or anything, or goggles or anything resembling that. So they're fumbling around in the dark with the water temperature underneath 50 degrees in Greece at that time of the year would have been less than 15 degrees. Wow. And doing working dives where one of them was measured at, and Haggy said it was sort of par for the course, was measured at 6 minutes 47 seconds. Come on, guys. These people were superbly adapted. How did they equalize? It was very simple. They burst their eardrums. So they flooded. Yeah, all this, the whole story, led to a hell of a lot of developments that are not been discussed, absorbed, or even thought about. I'm not recommending that we should all go out and burst our eardrums. But flooding is viable, providing you're not in the greatly polluted waters. But I think there are, and we've come across better forms of equalization. But if that helps to answer why I got into it, there are a lot of stories that were really, really inspiring. The Greeks were the masters. They were the pioneers. And they were doing it for thousands of years before people, the eminent Western scientists were saying your lungs are going to collapse at 50 meters. The Minoans were using free divers. You can see it recorded pictorially with them. Okay, that's the story. Now, back to the chase here. What we're trying to do here is show you a little bit how you should be doing RV training if you clicked onto the idea that it might be a good idea if you're going into a new environment to try to adapt yourself to that environment. That kind of can help with things like lung squeeze, blackouts and deep water blackouts and all kinds of nonsense. Yeah, simply because you are much, much better adapted. Okay, so what we're going to talk about first, MT is going to talk about her training. Then I'm going to tell you more how that fits in with the whole plan of what each phase of RV is supposed to do for you. In other words, how to do it, and the things not to do. And that may give you some sort of direction. So I'm going to pass over to MT now. MT, I've known for a few years. We were actually married. Actually, we're still married, I think. But we have an ideal marriage. She lives in Mexico, I live in Israel. She is a superb athlete and always has been. She's a very brave lady as well. And apart from being extremely athletic, and even the animals are domestic animals like her. So who am I to argue with them? So anyway, she's done a lot of very deep dives in the past. So I'm going to pass over to her, and she's going to tell you how when she came to Israel, she hadn't been diving for a long time deep, and she decided she wanted to get there, and she had maybe limited time. So over to MT.
Okay, I've got my little notebook from the time that I was diving in Israel this time. And it's interesting. I do have almost 30 years of free diving, plus martial arts before that, and an awareness of body, movement, form. So I might be describing in the RV1 and RV2 and then RV3, you might find that my progress is perhaps a little bit faster than somebody who doesn't have maybe that practice. So I was surprised. I'm reviewing my notes. I started my first RV breath walk on empty lung breath walk on February the 2nd, 2024. And then went into the sea. After that, that was early morning before anything, just one repetition. And I walked 41 paces for 48 seconds. And then let it go, just one. It's a stimulus. That's what Aharon always says. Don't do multiple, because if you, in your mind, know that you're doing another one to make up for the one that didn't work so well, your body relaxes. It's not on point in the same way. So it's just one go. And then I went to the water and I did 5 repetitions, RV1. I've done them before, but I've never done RV training without a break in it. So in this period in Israel, I decided I'm not teaching, I'm not coaching. I am going to concentrate entirely on empty lung, nothing else in between. I did some surface monofinning, but for the first week, so I was surprised. My RV2, which means you get to a certain depth before you go from RV1 to RV2. So I'm just giving you a timeline without any detail. So RV1, February the 2nd, February the 7th, I started RV2 because 1, 2, 3, 4. I had 4 sessions with RV1, and in those 4 sessions, I went from 41-second dive, 10.6 meters, to 14.7 to 17.7 on the second one, to 17.6 on the third, and then maybe on the fourth dive, I had a bit of a sticky ear, so my dives were less, but I still had achieved 17, nearly 18 meters. So then, on the 7th of February, I shifted to RV2. So I'd had 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th dive session was RV2. So then I carry on with RV2. I do some monofinning. I did break on one occasion. I did a monofin dive to 40 meters just to play around with the monofin. I did a 40-meter pre-immersion for time, where the up and down was 3 minutes. So in the second week, I combined RV2 and I did a trial long dive for time, and I did playing with the monofin. I think I was able to enter that RV2 in that way because of the many years of experience. Perhaps for individuals without so much background training, it might be a better idea not to break up that RV2 with breath hold dives. Anyway, I'm just going to give an idea of when I started. I was continually, maybe once or twice a week, doing dry walks, empty lung. I was in the water maybe 3 times a week, not more. I had days off, resting. I didn't do very much in between on the rest days, because rest days were rest days, but I did use a Pilates ball to roll back on and just hang out on it as a lung expansion exercise. So I carry on with RV2. It's Monday, it's to the 26th. I come to the end of February, and I had an opportunity to help teach a course. So I took 5 days out, helping teach a shallow course, but that also broke up the RV. And that was at the end of February. So I've already had 4 weeks of training, more or less. Then we start into March. I do I'm continuing with the RV. I begin to make some RV1 to begin, and then midway through the session, I swap to RV2. The cherry on the cake, I'm going to give you the first dive to depth. I did a drop, and the drops were to 55 meters, because we had to swim out, and we had a setup within the park limits. We couldn't go any further. So we just stayed with the 50-meter drops. I think I did 2 drops, And my first boat dive into deep water, just to accustom myself to the timing of the equalization, because when you're doing RV1 and RV2, you're covering very little distance. So the rhythm of the equalizing has to reflect depth, but not distance, not the distance all the time. So I readjusted my equalization to very fast with the shallower dives, RV. So I needed to balance out the feeling for equalization when I did the drops and when I did the first deep dive. So my first deep dive, which was a 2-minute 20 dive and then a 2-minute dive, were 51.2 and 50.8 meters. We had the
Look,
setup
I'm
on a
going to
boat.
stop you there for a second because there's a missing piece here, and I think people will find it difficult following it. Look, we have to tell them what the difference between RV1 and RV2 is.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's already gone quite a long way in that. RV1, you're diving in totally empty lungs and you use the last of your air to fill your cheeks. And you're not using your tongue at all. You're moving the air towards your eustachian tubes by exerting pressure on the cheeks. You can think of it as squeezing your cheeks a bit, or you can think of it as like you're bringing more air into the cheeks. Whichever way you like to think of it, it's the same thing. It's using your cheeks to push air into the eustachian tubes, which is a very gentle process. It's preparing you mentally and physically for RV2. RV2, yeah, you're going down totally empty lungs, absolutely exhaled to the absolute maximum. Give you an idea of that now. That is RV2, not. Let's make no mistake about that. It is pushing out everything that you can push out short of reverse packing. That's very important. Where is the air coming from in order to equalize in RV2? Okay, good question. First of all, we don't need so much air. The next thing is maybe it's coming from, if you're 20% RV, some of that, 20% is rather a lot of air there somewhere. Maybe there's some kind of access to that. Look, the main thing is we are doing the reverse of what everybody else is doing. We are not closing the glottis, we are not putting the soft palate in neutral, and we are not using our tongue to push air into the eustachian tubes. We'll talk about actually what we do later on, but those are the things that we're not doing, and the mystery of where the air is coming from is a good one, but it comes and it works perfectly. We're trying to get to what we call unconscious equalization. If you have a child, 3 months old, and he's going up in an aeroplane, particularly one that doesn't have a brilliantly pressurized cockpit like the old ones, yeah, or going up a steep hill in a car, their ears pop automatically. You're not teaching the child Frenzel, yeah, with M-lock, K-lock, T-lock, and hemlock, I don't know, in order to equalize. Because at 3 months old, I don't think you're going to be very successful. They do it at the absolute optical moment in reaction to the pressure without intervention of the conscious mind. So our relationship with the conscious mind begins to disappear in RV2. That's why we call the equalization we're going to learn unconscious equalization. So this, the slip from that into this, the passage about it, we'll talk more about that later, but the main thing that differentiates the two is in RV1, you've got a reserve of air in the cheeks to push into your eustachian tubes. The other, you're actually using pressure differentials and you're using a completely different concept of what's happening to the body at depth to actually, if you keep all the gates open, it equalizes by itself. Okay, we'll come to that. Sounds complicated, but I thought we were beginning to lose the plot there a little bit first. So back to you, MT, and you were talking mainly about RV2 at this stage.
Yes, and I also think to add to that is that by the time we swap over to RV2, the body is much more relaxed, and there's an awareness that grows between RV1 and RV2 that allows the letting go to happen. And the interesting thing is you start without an expectation of doing any depth at all. So maybe my first incursions into RV2, empty lung, completely with no mouth fill, no cheek fill, probably I was at 4 or 5 meters. And just relax the body. And as I progressed, that RV2 became 12 meters. And in my own way, I felt that I became an observer, a much keener observer in my own training in what was happening during the dives. And if there was a flicker, because there's always an old adaptive technique that you're trying to replace. So one of the rules in RV1 and RV2 is if you find that you're getting to the end of your potential, you can't jump in. You have to stop yourself jumping in with that, what people say, well, the end equalization might turn into a frenzel. So if that happened, you become aware of it and you stop earlier. Don't get enticed by being able to say, oh, I did 3 extra meters because I finished with a frenzel. Because that frenzel will be your limiting factor. RV1, RV2, etc. So it might happen at the end, but you've got to stop. And if people are beginning this exercise, typically they might say, oh, I just automatically moved my tongue into a frenzel. So with those people, it didn't necessarily happen to me because I was already familiar with constant pressure and pumping, very fast pumping until the end. And if I found that the last reflex became frenzel, I would stop early, catch myself, don't allow it to happen because that's reinforcing a pattern that you don't need, and then I'd come back up. So at the end of the day, what I find in the progress of everything that I was doing was that I was more or less 6 weeks, almost entirely doing RV1 or RV2. There were a couple of courses of 4 days, a couple of training days where I did long hangs at 40, a couple of monofin dives to about 40 in all of that 6 weeks. And then I got on the boat the first time at the end of March, on the 27th of March, I think it was. And because I hadn't done depth with full lungs, I played safe, and I think I just did 55. And I had a bit of a sticky ear. So that weekend, my dives were 52 and 55, full lung, 6 weeks after the RV training. There was a 2-week gap between my next boat dive, but in that 2 weeks we did a couple of repeat 55 meter, maybe a 57 meter drop. We couldn't get any more deeper because of where we were swimming, and it was in off limits by the Navy. So we were limited by how far we could swim to. 2 weeks after that 27th of March, I declared 63 meters because I knew that my limiting factor, if any, would be equalization. And I was already familiar with a 3-minute and 3-minute 15 long dives, full lung. So time wasn't an issue. And I thought maybe my equalization would stop me. So I did the 63, I hit the bottom plate, and I had time and energy and capability to extend for another meter by hanging with one hand with the watcher, with my dive computer a little bit below the bottom plate. I could read, I've lost the page, but I think the dives were generally around 3 minutes. I was diving in a 5 mil, brand new 5 mil open sail slick wetsuit, and I had 4 kilos on. So even so, I knew that there was resistance in the, especially in the pulling up. I could feel that resistance. But I was good at 3 minutes, 3 minutes 15. So the next day after the 63 meter, I declared 72. So we put the bottom plate at 72. I did no warm-up dives in any of them, and I got to the bottom plate still with the ability to equalize more. So I knew at least I could add a 4 or 5 or 6 meters if I had had another dive. But my last dive was on Saturday, the 20th of April, and I actually did 72.5 because that's as far as I could reach to hang. My dive time was 3 minutes 3. And I felt like it was a super relaxed dive. And coming up, I felt I had all the time in the world. It was not rushed in any way. I did maybe 3 clearing breaths, no blue lips, felt fine, and felt so confident that in my mind I'd reset, I can do 80. In this way, I can do 80. So I actually had 4 or maybe 5 dive opportunities at depth with free immersion to get back to knowing that I had hit 72.3, 72.5 without a problem. So I knew that there was more coming, but my opportunities stopped because I was leaving Israel shortly after that. And I'm back in Mexico, but I haven't had a lot of time to experiment with anything because several issues, including a very tardy house move. So I'm curious now to get back into RV diving when I get back into the water, training, nothing else, to see how much of that reflex has stayed with me and to catalogue how many dives a week on RV before I feel I'm back to where I was in Israel. Is that going to be a week? Is it going to be 2 weeks with 2 or 3 dives a week before I feel I'm ready for depth again? That's where my curiosity is right at the moment for the summer. The water isn't particularly good visibility or particularly warm, strangely enough here in the
Well,
Bahamas.
there you lose out because we're 31 degrees, visibility 30 meters,
Yeah, we
no
know that.
current, and conditions are pretty good. Other than political currents, other than a war and a lot of bullshit in the country, but you know the whole story here. I want to just back wheel for a minute. That 72-meter dive, when you came to the surface, you had a ridiculous grin on your face, and you took one breath before you gave the okay sign and said, I'm okay. And of course, you'd taken off your nose clip before that. And it looked about as easy as it could possibly be imagined to be. You were
For that,
thoroughly
for
composed, you were thoroughly in your thing. And I was terrified that now you'd hit the surface, we would get all the words. Because above the surface, you're not known for your silence, darling.
that,
So I think that's why one of the big compulsions for us taking up freediving was because you could, as a man, escape from the noise when you got under. Never mind, I'll pay for this later. Don't worry. But it was, in every sense of the word, we have pictures of it, videos of it, a superb dive, and minimum number of dives because all the adaptation had happened. Reiterate, she had the equalization, she had the breath hold, yeah, plus, and everything was in that sense in her favor. So what could go wrong? Okay, the equalization could screw up. If it did, she was quite prepared to do an early turn. It didn't, because by then it was embedded. And this is the whole thing. By then, it had become unconscious equalization. I did not control it. It happened by itself in reaction to pressure, which, as she said, that was when she came up, that was a ridiculously easy dive. And perhaps one of the easiest dives I've done, ever. Now, she's
And
had an
it was
awful lot of
resistant.
years diving. What?
It was a
Sorry, I didn't.
resistant training dive because of the millimeters of the wetsuit and because of the weights.
Exactly.
So
I mean, she
if
could
you
have, if she'd
replace
been
all
in
that with,
a 1 millimeter or between 1 and 2 millimeter orca or something, and carrying instead of 4 kilos, carrying maybe half a kilo, maybe, then that dive would have been just ridiculously easy. And she was stopped by fate. Yeah, having lost a house that she'd been in Mexico for 14 years, and suddenly being told that that's not available anymore. You know, get out. That's not easy. So there were, if you like it, psychological issues hanging over her head and everything. And with all the pressures of a country at war, the pressures of Eilat being a target, and the alarms having gone off several times, and bangs and loud noises, and all this, and the lady performed flawlessly. So I think it kind of proves the point, because this year I have trained or brought people over the 3-figure threshold, something like 8 people since the beginning of the year, and all of them, when they got the equalization, said it was ridiculously easy. Because look, what's happening, guys, is this. With all the K-lock, T-lock, M-lock, and all the rest of the thing, people doing a friends will tend to force it when they get deep. A little bit more force. Of course, the more expert you are, the more you learn to relax at depth, but you are still in control of the thing. It rarely becomes totally automatic pilot. This is absolutely guaranteed to be automatic pilot, and that makes a huge difference. You cannot use force against the sea or against
can
yourself. It
I,
doesn't work.
can I
Yeah,
interject
please.
just briefly? When you mentioned equalization, so there's unconscious equalization to get to the depth, but hand in hand with that is that when you're doing RV1 and RV2, there isn't a concept really as strong in your mind, the build up psychologically that you need when you're doing 70, 80, 90, 100 meters. So you take that away and you get into the water curious, but if I want to call it ego, the ego isn't pushing for a depth psychologically, because you know you'll be stopped initially RV2 maybe in 5 meters, and you're up on the surface thinking, what went wrong? What did I feel? So for me, the whole process, very much so, that probably triggered not having to manipulate the equalizing, was no psychological pressure to have to go deep. So they're pretty short dives. They're fascinating when suddenly you think, I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm learning to relax and keep constant pressure. And suddenly you're at 15, 17, 18, 20. I think I actually did 25 meters on RV1. But the ego isn't so strong. You become more curious in 5 meters. What happened? What stopped me in 5? And the curiosity um, gives you the upper hand because you're not pushing. And so if anybody tends to want to push emotionally, psychologically, and physically through depth, you don't have that with RV1 and RV2. So for me, it was the most exploratory, relaxed, curious training that I think I've ever done over the period of almost 30 years. And I came out of the water with a silence and an observation of being able to describe what happened rather than control what happened all the way. And there's a bit of a fuzzy line between observing and realizing what you're doing, and especially for the end frenzel, not choosing not to allow that. So maybe that part is the conscious part. Don't allow yourself to do a frenzel. That's a really important part because it kicks in instantly for most people because they can do 3 more meters on a shallow dive. So say, don't do it. What do you gain? Nothing. Wait. Go back, try again, avoid a frenzel. Go back, try again, avoid the frenzel. And you'll suddenly see, without a frenzel, you still get deeper, but you put in a frenzel, that's going to be your last equalization because you can't really go back to mouthfill once you've done
Yeah.
the frenzel. So it's going to be a limiting factor.
Amen.
Yeah.
That was beautifully put. Yeah, you absolutely did right. And this has been echoed by quite a lot of other people. It's remarkable how the rapportage of the same story is similar in most cases, in all cases.
And also what might kick in with divers who are, I was 1000% convinced. I've been talking about this with Aharon for 2 or 3 or 4 years, but where I was teaching, I couldn't practice what we wanted to do, what I was able to practice because I was teaching all the time. So in this occasion, I dedicated 1000% of my time to this adaptation technique. I didn't question it, and I didn't worry at all that I was coming out of the water after a session saying, hey, I did 15 meters, or I did 17. Other people I noticed who began the training, let's say intermediate to advanced divers, they'd come out and after about a week, they wanted more progress. They wanted to push. And some people said, it's not working. I'm not getting where I should be. I think I should be going back to depth diving, which is the ego. And it's really curious because you think you haven't given it the time it needs. You haven't given a time for adaptive training. So if you swap now to doing your deep dives because you feel that the adaptive training is limiting that you won't keep that 45-meter dive, you'll lose it. That's a wrong pattern of thinking as well. So you can drop that thought. Did I explain that well enough, Aharon, to you?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I'm going to get into here. You think it's a place for it? I want to talk about what not to do. Yeah, why this is not working for a lot of people. Let's talk about the people who are in very cold climates first. Yeah, where the water may be 10 degrees or less, or even 12 degrees and less. They all want to dive in a mask because they want that area of their face that's exposed to be warm. Cold water is almost like a knife, particularly if you hit thermoclines. Guys, if somebody is telling me I'm doing RV training and I'm doing it in a mask, my answer is one of two things, guy. Either it's not RV, yeah, which is highly possible, because if you've got a mask, yeah, and you're doing a true RV, yeah, that's a truly empty, you haven't got the air to equalize that mask. That's going to create a vacuum, and in very short space of time, no more equalization, guy. So it's going to sabotage you. It's like trying to do it with goggles, non-flooded goggles. It doesn't work too well. So what can they do? What can they buy? Oh yes, I've got a system. I'll flood the thing on the surface and at least it'll be warmer than underneath the thermocline. Because nobody nowadays wants to take the slightly harder path and the slightly longer path in order to get very good results. I have one Norwegian diver who has an RV of 16%. He's diving in very cold waters, less than 10 degrees, and he is doing true RV diving. And how is he doing it? Adaptive training. Because we worked out that one of the things you can do, and it helps you enormously, is you can all get a basin of cold water, yeah, and put less than 10 degrees, yeah, get a thermometer, a basin of water, and bottles of water in your fridge, yeah, and you get water less than 10 degrees, and you put your face in it for certain periods of time each day, maybe 2 or 3 times, yeah, and very soon you become totally adapted to the real cold, and it becomes actually nothing for you and no big deal. But you have to take the time to adapt to it. Yeah, I'm sorry, we haven't got some gizmo that you can buy in Alibaba or whatever the hell it is on the internet, and you actually have to do something about it. But if you do, it's solvable. Okay, that's one thing. Now another thing, and here MT may have confused us a little bit, because she was talking about doing dives and courses and everything else. You have to wait till you get to about at least 17 meters on RV1. Up to 17 meters, it becomes, you have to be totally, absolutely dedicated, in the sense, no full lung diving at all. You cannot go out with a diving session with a partner and do one dive RV for you and then do safety for him, and he's diving to 40 meters or something, and you're having to go down to 20 or more. Because if you do, you're making a nonsense of your RV training. You cannot expect a reflex to become set, yeah, and become unconscious if you're doing one thing 1 minute and something completely different the next. It ain't gonna happen, guys. So in RV1, you have to, there's a period where it's total dedication. You have to beg or whatever, a partner saying, look, for the next couple of weeks, I really would be very grateful if you dedicate yourself to me, and it can't be reciprocal. If you want to do RV training, that's fine. I'll observe it from the surface, or be ready for you on the surface. We'll organize signals on the line if the visibility is not that good, and I will leave the surface only if it's real emergency. Not ideal, better than nothing, but don't try and mix and match. Don't try and misuse RV training. Doing RV training while you're doing something else is nonsense, pure bullshit. Sorry. Doing RV training, I do my RV training, I do warm-ups for my full lung on RV. Well, what's that doing for you, guys? It's doing nothing. It's not bringing in your reflexes. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? Anyway, we also have a thing that we do not do warm-ups at all. And if you're learning RV1, you slip into that pattern because you're only going down 5 or 6 meters at first, yeah, or 4 or 5 meters. And you don't need any warm-up for that. You just do it. And as you go forward, you find that that's what's happening automatically. You're not doing warm-ups. You're doing the dive straight from the beginning. So it kind of sheds warm-ups very nicely. And I've had people make terrific gains just from shedding the warm-up. I can think of 2 recently. One guy who was doing 93 meters, shed the warm-ups and found himself over 100 in the easiest dive of his life. Why, guys? Because you're not wasting the spleen advantage. Your spleen doesn't go on contracting each time. Yeah, it's putting out its lovely reserve of red corpuscles, and that's it. Now, you can waste it on warm-up dives, or you can enjoy it as a terrific advantage during your main dive. So that's another thing that we do not do. Mix and match, stuff like that. Now, the other things that we do not do is, I'm going down, when I begin on RV1, and I'm going down maybe 5, 6, 7 meters, and I feel pressure here, maybe in the nose, maybe in the throat, maybe in the upper part of the chest. If I feel any pressure, come back. Do not go on. Do not push into the pressure. You're beginning to develop a language and a contract with your subconscious mind. This is the boss of what we call autonomic controls of autonomic systems. Okay? That's the boss. Now, he's not going to trust you if you try and push into, and he's giving you a hint. That's your limit for the moment. If you don't accept that hint, he will stop you. You just won't be able to equalize. And if you push further, you'll be pushing into pain, and you're pushing into eventually damage. But the worst thing perhaps for you is you're going to be delaying your progress by an awful lot. But if you take the hint, and the moment you feel pressure, return to the surface. You can do another 10 dives. And maybe it's not going to release you in that session. Maybe it's not going to release you for another 2 sessions. But the moment your subconscious begins to trust you, he'll say, okay, come on, try 2 more meters. And that actually is the fastest way to proceed. Respect. It's kind of conversation. Okay, that sounds kind of ephemeral, and it doesn't sound like... is there any scientific evidence for this? I'll tell you what. Yes, there is. We were working with a guy called Dr. Paul Gabbett years ago, and he was interested in one thing. He was interested in voluntary controls of autonomic functions. Okay. Well, how can we demonstrate that, he said to us. Well, you can do it by one thing, holding your breath. Okay. Now, when he looked at it from a totally scientific point of view. He looked particularly at the prefrontal cortex, the silent areas of the brain in those days, because you couldn't really examine them with current techniques back at the beginning of the 90s, yeah? Because the moment you used invasive techniques, of course, the whole thing became nonsense. Okay. Eventually, they got imaging that you could do that with non-invasive techniques. Now, the prefrontal cortex is an interesting animal. It's divided into 2 parts. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the orbitomedial prefrontal cortex. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, he called the cognitive executrix. Yeah? The cognitive executive. The orbitomedial was the emotional executrix. So you've got all your higher functions of the brain being done, of thinking, being done in the dorsolateral. The orbitomedial is, if you like it, emotional intelligence, reactive intelligence, and it's very much connected to your autonomic systems. Yeah, there are all sorts of synaptic paths between that and your medulla oblongata and pons, which is the unconscious, responsible for all the unconscious things that are going on in the body. Yeah, your body temperature, your heart rate, your everything that you do not consciously control that's going on in the body, your glandular secretions, everything that's going on there, that's controlled in what they call originally the reptilian center. It's medulla and pons, first part of the brain to be formed in an embryo, and afterwards other layers grow as the brain develops, like layers on top of that, until we get down to the wonderful brain that we've got today that we're busily misusing. Okay. Yes, there's been an awful lot of brain research into these things, but I'm constantly asked this thing about nearly every step of what I do. Is there any proof? Is there any scientific backing for this? Actually, I have here in one hand most of the true science. Dr. Per Schollander, the master switch of life. He's talking about the dive reflexes, yeah? Paul Gabbard, on the stuff that we were talking about just now. We have about 3 or 4 different people, including Erika Shakutai, Peter Lindholm, and Klaus Lundgren, going back to Lange Depth, but there's very few specific research for freediving. Look, that stuff costs money. Scientists like to be paid for their work. I don't know why. I mean, who likes to be paid for their work? And it can involve, if you're going through true scientific process, large groups, and probably 3 groups at least, large numbers of people, and all those things cost a shitload of money. And that is just not available in freediving. Most of what we know is narrative from elite freedivers, from competitions, from trainers, and stuff like that. How reliable is it? History has proved that some of it is not reliable, quite a lot. But on the other hand, history, looking back over quite a few years, has been probably the best test for what actually works. The story that I told you at the beginning about emotional to me, because it said, I mean, what's going on here? I mean, the scientists in 1953 were telling Enzo Maiorca, your lungs are going to collapse at 50 meters. And here are these guys in 1911 who were diving, did their first dives looking for it, to over 100 long dives. And what's going on here, guys? What's going on? How did they equalize? Temperatures are stark naked, 15 degrees and dark down there on a mud and sand slope. Thank you. Clomping around with this 14-kilo chunk of marble in your hand. Because if you let go of that, there was no way home. Yeah? I mean, they had it pretty rough then. But, yeah, they were doing it, and the scientists were saying it was impossible. So there's all these things. You can't just say, is there any scientific proof for it? Because very often the scientists were wrong. I'm dealing with one today. With Erika, we'll deal with that in another story. But it was a privilege this time working with MT, truly. I mean, apart from all the nonsense we talk backwards and forwards with each other, it really was a privilege, and a privilege watching the development, a privilege watching the dedication, a privilege watching that the whole thing was bearing fruit and blooming, and her awareness and ability to communicate what was happening was equally impressive. And I'm going to pass you back to her, because as a finishing note, for me, this has been a wonderful experience. Thank you, MT. Thank you all the people who've helped us, Tom Pellet and Roma and a lot of other people, and now Anael, who's helped us with the videos enormously in the podcast. Without that, I would be talking to the cats or the wall, which is my usual thing. Really, thank you, people. And we've had wonderful support from a wonderful team and backbone team.
No, I will say the same. I enjoyed the intellectual side after the training, just discussing feedback. So Aaron has an incredible focus for freedive training. He communicates that incredibly well. And when I participated, we found areas of incredible intensity describing what was happening. So at the same time, Aaron was giving feedback to another diver, and we could almost plan what that other diver from 90 meters to 95 to 97 to over 100 was going to go through. So I could give a description of that, listen to the communication with the online coaching, and understand exactly what the troubles were, maybe what the guy was going through that wasn't working or could work. And then with that discussion with Aaron, it just was like illuminating, because we saw the progress in that other person. So it wasn't just me, it has been the other divers. It's incredibly fascinating. It's the most interesting training I've ever done. The quietest mind under the water for me, and the softest response physically, because it really is about letting your body fall into relaxation, into softness. And that's the key, because when you turn those training dives into full lung, the body is not resisting anymore because it doesn't feel pressure. It's adapted to the pressure, it's adapted to the time, it's adapted to the equalization, it's adapted to the rhythm. I haven't gone into detail about the amazing realizations of, oh, when you're empty lung, the frequency of equalization, if you're aware, is very different. You have to readapt when you're doing deep dives. So there were many points that we could go into depth. We even made a phrase of, we've got an RV3 in there somewhere, which was about air retrieval at very, like, instantly at 2 meters, not any deeper, 2, maybe 3 meters. So we kind of coined the phrase, this is RV3. We didn't really mention that very much, but it was interesting also. So I thank Aaron for his genius, and I'm really happy that we're putting this on video so that maybe other people can be interested and drop all of this push for, I've got to be deep, I've got to do it the traditional way, I've got to do it in the way that I'm familiar with. Sometimes you've got to trust. I've been told many times on other levels, not just with freediving, you've got to step into the void sometimes, knowing that everything is going to be okay because the preparation determines that. So thank you for your genius.